Good morning, friends. This is Reverend Susan Burnham at St. George Episcopal Church in San Antonio, Texas. I welcome you to this next edition of the Introduction to the New Testament. Today we're going to be looking at the letter to the Hebrews and also the Epistle of James. And so let's go ahead and get started. Just as FYI, they have nothing in common. This is just how the schedule of the class. I mean, they both are in the New Testament, but they're not related, thus I kept them together. It's just this is how the schedule worked out. So let's get started. Hebrews. Well, who wrote it? Well, originally a lot of people thought St. Paul wrote Hebrews, but it's really not likely to be St. Paul. And I am definitely in that camp that says it's not St. Paul. The theology and style are not really in line with his other writings. The author is not identified, and many times St. Paul says, I, Paul, am writing you, grace to you and peace, etc., etc. That doesn't happen here. The author did know Greek very well, and he also knew Judaism very well, and it sounds like he was he was also fairly familiar with philosophy, so he was a well-educated person who's probably maybe a Hellenistic Jew. And what I mean by Hellenistic Jew is that there was a cohort of folks that were Jewish and lived throughout the region, and as Greek culture kind of inundated their lands, they learned the Greek language. They learned how to write in Greek. They kind of took on some of the Greek philosophy and Greek ideology. And so that's what I mean by a Hellenized Jew. They're still Jewish, but they take on kind of the culture of the Greeks. So the author is likely addressing Jews. We aren't sure what city they are in or the author is in, but it's probably one of the larger ones. We know that when they're talking about philosophy, etc., it's usually a larger city where people are coming and going and learning and teaching new things. I lean towards Rome. There's other thoughts about Alexandria and some of the other larger cities, port cities as well. But if you read the end of the letter, you might think, hey, this might be Rome. Anyway, and the reason he was writing the letter was possibly they were thinking of returning to Judaism instead of Christianity because of persecution, because there was some serious persecution, hardship. Christianity is not an easy walk. We know that. Laziness, disillusionment, or perhaps they were swayed by some new philosophy. I keep mentioning Gnosticism, and it was a pretty rampant philosophy back then and school of thought. So it's possible for any of these reasons, or all of them, or some of them, or none of them, that people were not following Christianity and kind of reverting back to Judaism. So what we're going to see about the Hebrews, the book, the Epistle to the Hebrews, is that they talk a lot about Christ's superiority over certain things. So the first one, Christ's superiority to previous revelation, and this is chapter 1, 1 through 3. And I just love this quote by Dr. Blair, so I just went ahead and summed it up with this. God has expressed his ultimate and complete revelation by a son. And Jesus is not just any son, but the creator and heir of all things. He is the beginning and goal of all things. He has established his power and authority over all things. And I really like that. He is the beginning and goal. We don't hear a lot that phrase a lot. We hear the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega, but I love this way of phrasing it, that he's the beginning and the goal. That's a fantastic way to think about it. Just keep that in mind. Coming next, we've got Christ's superiority over the angels. So once again, we're talking about Christ is superior to. And we think this is probably alluding to part of the heavenly hosts of God. And Christ is superior, and Christ is the one to whom they should give their loyalty, not any set of angels or archangels or any in the company of heaven, as that sounds pretty familiar with the liturgy, doesn't it? No, Christ is superior to the angels. He is the one to whom we and they should worship. Christ's superiority over Moses and Aaron. And so here we see that the author of Hebrews does know Judaism. They speak of the Old Covenant. Moses and Aaron were leaders of the Old Covenant, and Jesus Christ is the New Covenant. And the Sabbath, I love this because we see all this talk about Sabbath in these chapters. And it's like, why are you talking about the Sabbath all of a sudden? This seems weird to me. But the Sabbath pointed to an everlasting rest and represented fellowship with God, a day in which the people put other concerns aside to have an undisturbed relationship with God. It is in Christ Jesus that humanity finds rest eternal. So with the Old Covenant, you got a day of rest. With the New Covenant, you get eternal rest. That's kind of neat, if you ask me. Christ's superiority over the Levitical priesthood. So once again, we're anchoring back to the Old Testament and the Levitical priesthood. And so Christ is the great high priest. And then they talk a little bit about Melchizedek, who was like the great Old Testament high priest, really. He had no genealogy. A time of birth, or date of birth and death are not given for him. He actually stands as the only person in history as the one and only priest of his kind, and he is so forever. So Melchizedek is the priest of the Old Testament. Jesus Christ is the one and only priest who sacrificed himself. Melchizedek sacrificed, bulls and doves, and they did their ritual sacrificial system. That was how they worshipped. And Jesus Christ sacrificed himself. And so, therefore, there is no further need for sacrifices to be made daily, since Christ's sacrifice was once for all. And you'll maybe hear about this sometime if you talk to your Catholic friends, and they talk about the Mass. And at the Catholic Mass, they re-sacrifice Christ each time, or at least that's the last time I heard or asked a priest about their doctrine of the Eucharist or Mass, was that priest was re-sacrificing Christ each time they celebrated a Mass. And ours is not in line with that. Ours says Christ was sacrificed once for all. We're not re-sacrificing Jesus Christ when we break the host. So just a little tidbit there. Christ's superiority through the new covenant and the new sanctuary. I thought this was really neat. I had completely forgotten about this from 20 years ago and had not caught it in my reading of the Bible. So this is neat. In the old covenant, if the old covenant had been sufficient, there would have been no need for the new. That's pretty easy. The tent and tabernacle that Moses built was an earthly tent. Christ serves as a heavenly sanctuary. I love that phrase, that Christ serves as this heavenly sanctuary. We rest in Christ. I think you've heard that before. And note that the exalted Jesus Christ, supreme and superior, is the one who serves, who had given and continues to give in behalf of humanity. So Jesus Christ, superior to everyone and everything else, but is the servant to all. And that is the epitome of the explanation of God's love right there, and the example we should follow. So practical responses to the superiority of Christ. This is kind of how we wind up, and this is a super short summation. I hope you'll go read the book of Hebrews. It had been quite a while since I've actually sat down and studied Hebrews. And, when I opened my Bible, there was a lot of underlining and little notes in the margins. So it's a good book. It'll make you think and pique your interest. So take a look at it. Practical responses. Believers should persevere and not shrink back. Faith should be their manner of life. Jesus is the ultimate example. They should practice brotherly love, practice hospitality, practice ethical living, and be equipped with every good so that they may do God's will. Seems pretty self-explanatory that it took 3 chapters for him to say it, but we got it bullet pointed for you. Anyway, that's the super short version of the book of Hebrews. If you have any questions or want to discuss it, please feel free to email me or text me or call me and we can chat about it. And then we move on to the book of James, Faith in Christ, Issues and Works. I personally love the book of James. I did a paper in undergrad at Houston Baptist about the tongue, basically, and how it can take us in the wrong direction. James uses the ship metaphor and another metaphor. I did a Greek exegesis on kind of the tongue going astray type deal from the Epistle of James. So it has a place near and dear to my heart. James is one of the general epistles that includes James, First and Second Peter, First, Second, and Third John, and Jude. And they're called the general epistles or the Catholic epistles, meaning universal Catholic, not Roman Catholic. And this is for two reasons. They are mostly addressed to a general church audience or were to be read by more than one church. And as a group of letters, the title general, quote unquote, helps to distinguish them from St. Paul's letters. So that's just kind of a help for us. James. Now, who's the author? Which James? We know there's a whole lot of Jameses in the New Testament, don't we? So there are three Jameses that could be the author. James, the son of Zebedee, who was the brother of John, but he died fairly early, and this letter was probably written after that. And then we have James, the son of Alphaeus, but there's no real connection that can be made between the two. And then we have James, the Lord's brother, and he is likely the author. This is the camp that I sit in. He was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. The letter has a strong Jewish tone, emphasizing ethical conduct. The letter is in Greek, but the tone is the Old Testament. And the simple identity as, he says, servant, lends itself to somebody well known. So that kind of all lends itself to it being James, the Lord's brother. James, living with trials and temptations. James instructed Christians to meet trials with joy because a tested faith works patience. In other words, it's going to make you stronger the more you go through. That kind of cheerleading doesn't really sit that well with me, but there it is. Basically, you should learn from your trials and grow stronger, which I can completely agree with that. God is not the source of temptation or of testing, either by evil or toward evil. In other words, you could take a look at C.S. Lewis's problem of pain. God is not the source of evil. That's actually a Gnostic idea. James instructs his readers to seek wisdom, and I love this quote. Wisdom is a person's knowledge and life informed from God's viewpoint. Such wisdom can only come by faith, because faith in God leads to the divine perspective. Wisdom is a person's knowledge and life informed from God's viewpoint. So if you say that person is wise, and you mean it in a way that St. James was writing, it would mean they see things in a very big picture. They see God's perspective. They see the perspective of the cross. That's the wisdom. James, Christian action in the church. James encouraged his readers to put away evil. They were to be doers of the word, not merely hearers. Y'all heard that. They were to control their tongues, and you'll see the different analogies that he uses for the tongue, like the rudder of a ship, it steers you. And then they were to look after the widows and the orphans. They were to take care of the disenfranchised of society. And this was a big one. The church was to show no partiality, because they're struggling with, well, we got some wealthy donors over here, so we're going to work things around their needs. And James is saying, no, you have to be with everyone. Don't show any partiality to the wealthy. And then the old real faith results in good works, which I know y'all have heard. Faith without works is dead, etc., etc. Real faith just results in good works. James, conduct outside the church. So James addresses kind of the ethical issues of right and wrong that are, not particular to the church. He warned about conflicts seen in quarrels and fights outside of the church, that the answer was to submit to God. And then he asked them to use the phrase, if such and such is God's will, then that's what we're going to do. And I kind of just shortened it a little bit to, if it's God's will, so shall it be. That attitude shows not only appreciation for the sovereignty of God, but it also shows a dependence on Him. And James warns against dependence on and abuse of wealth. And then he has his closing instructions. James speaks of patience in the face of suffering. Once again, these trials are going to make you strong for Jesus, right? All right. He instructs them to have confidence in the return of the Lord. Persevering like the prophets and Job's. So you see the Old Testament being cited here. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Prayer should be a central activity of the church. Members who wander away from the truth should be ministered to, and Christians are responsible for one another. And part of this kind of parallels with the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. Go check it out, see if you can find the parallels there. It's kind of a fun thing to do if you've got time and are interested. Anyway, that sums up James as well as Hebrews. And so if you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me or call me, text me, whatever. I'm around. And that's sburnham@stgeorgechurch.org. And I appreciate you hanging out and viewing this video. And I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.